My father spent everything he had on my brother's medical school, calling me stupid and refusing to help me with my own business. Now, he's come asking for my money. But before I dive into the mess that followed, let me take a moment to give you some background about my family, so everything makes sense. I'm 21, a guy from a broken home. My parents split up when I was in middle school. The reason? My dad had an affair with his secretary. I didn't find out until I was older, but looking back, I could always feel the tension in their relationship. Even as a kid, I noticed it, the way they stayed together, but something was always off. They were there, physically, but emotionally, I could tell they weren't in love anymore. And it wasn't just me. When I saw other families, the way they laughed together, their joy, it was so clear that wasn't us. We weren't happy. I also have an older brother. And while you might think that coming from a broken home would bond us, that couldn't have been further from the truth. No, my brother was always a jerk, especially to me. From when we were kids, he seemed to have this endless need to tear me down. The bullying never stopped, and it didn't end at home, it followed me everywhere, like a shadow I couldn't escape. The worst part? My parents took sides. My mom was on my side, always trying to protect me. But my dad? He always supported my brother. Eric, he was 25, and the worst person to grow up with. He was cruel, relentless, and he never missed a chance to belittle me in front of his friends. Physically, I was smaller than him, so I had no choice but to run to my mom. That only made it worse. People saw me as a mama's boy. My mom would always step in, telling him off, but it hardly helped. And my dad? He'd brush it off, saying I needed to toughen up, that it was part of becoming a man. But I didn't want that. I didn't want to fight. I just wanted peace. But for some reason, my dad and brother just couldn't stand the idea of me living a peaceful life. They constantly found ways to torment me, and even when my mom tried to shield me, it wasn't enough. She had so much on her plate, keeping the house in order, taking care of us, and it was impossible for her to constantly keep an eye on everything. So, I learned to accept it. To stop complaining and just let things roll off my back. It was easier than fighting it. But everything changed in 8th grade. My mom sat me down and told me she was separating from my dad. At the time, I didn't know all the reasons behind it, but I understood enough to know it was for the best. She didn't give me the full story, but I assumed it was because my dad was just a terrible person to be married to. Later on, though, I learned the truth. The affair, those texts between my dad and his secretary, that was the breaking point for my mom. She'd had enough. One day, we were talking, and she revealed something I hadn't expected. My dad never even wanted me. She had wanted a second child, but my dad was dead set against it. Their financial struggles were real, and having another child seemed like too much for them. But my mom wouldn't back down. She refused to give me up, even threatening divorce. She told me that's when things started to fall apart between them, even though they could have handled it better. My dad's resentment toward me had only worsened after I was born. She felt guilty about it, about my terrible childhood, and apologized for not leaving him sooner. But she'd stayed, thinking it was better for us, that leaving would only hurt us more. And yet, staying ended up causing far more damage. I love my mother, I do. But part of me wishes she'd been more honest with me sooner. She only told me the real reasons behind everything when I was in my final year of high school. They had already been divorced for years. But even then, it wasn't over. Custody arrangements meant I spent my weekends with my dad, while my brother spent his weekends with my mom. And that just made everything worse. I had no love for my brother, none at all. In fact, it was more than just a sibling rivalry, it was deep-rooted resentment. My mother understood this. So, when the divorce rolled around, she knew that the last thing I wanted was to be under the same roof as my brother and my father. That was a nightmare I couldn't face. My mother agreed, even though my dad wasn't pleased with the arrangement. He insisted it was crucial for me to bond with my brother, but I couldn't see how. How could I bond with someone who had been nothing but a monster to me? Thankfully, my mother took my side, making sure I didn't have to spend more time with him than absolutely necessary. I spent most of my time growing up with her. But despite that, we still had to come together for the holidays. And let me tell you, they were never easy. After the divorce, my dad began dating his secretary, and my mom could hardly stand it. At least he had the decency not to bring her around during the holidays, but my mother knew the truth, and it boiled inside her. Every holiday felt like walking on eggshells. It was tense, uncomfortable. But somehow, we managed to get through it, because that was what my father wanted. My mother reluctantly agreed, even though by this point, she had put a massive emotional distance between us and him. This was the bare minimum she could do to keep up the facade of family, so we could pretend to be connected by blood. We tried. We really did. But beneath the surface, the truth was clear: none of us liked each other. My brother and I had made our choices about which parent we favored, and so had my parents. It wasn't right, but it was what it was. So yeah, I'll say it, my family was a mess. A chaotic, dysfunctional mess, and my childhood was a strange, twisted version of normal. But I kept in touch with my dad, even after the truth came out during my senior year. My mother had told me that he was supposed to pay for my college education, and she feared if I found out about everything, I'd fight with him and lose that funding. She never told me the full truth because she was scared of what it might mean for my future. After all, she had only started working after the divorce and didn't have nearly enough to send me to the college I dreamed of. So, in my mind, my dad was my best shot. It was hard, though, very hard. But I kept trying to stay on good terms with him, even if it felt like he was still mistreating me, like he hadn't changed a bit. Then, right before I was supposed to graduate, everything fell apart. I found out that my dad had never planned to fund my college education at all. All those years of being nice, keeping up appearances, doing everything right, it had all been in vain. No college fund, no help. My dad continued to look down on me, pushing me further away. That's when a group of friends and I made a bold decision: we were going to skip college and start our own business. It wasn't something we did lightly, it was a huge risk. But we were passionate, driven by the idea that college wouldn't speed up our journey to success. Why wait? Why follow the path that everyone expected us to take? I was the one who first floated the idea of starting a business. At first, it was just a joke. Something to laugh about, a fantasy. But then, it clicked. We all agreed we were going to build a clothing and accessory line. We wanted to shake up the space because, in our neighborhood, every store either carried mass-produced junk or products that felt completely out of touch with how we wanted to dress. We wanted to wear something that felt like us. There was a problem, though: we couldn't find anything we liked. Everything felt either outdated or not made for people like us. We found ourselves either digging through thrift stores for old clothes or worse, looking like our dads. It was a joke at first, but it hit us: if we were feeling this way, maybe others were too. And just like that, our brand was born. Looking back, I'm so glad we took that risk. We had no experience. None. But we were determined. And now, as we've grown, I'm proud of what we've built. College? It doesn't matter. We took the leap, and it worked out for us. It was me and 3 of my closest friends, brainstorming for months, pouring our hearts into the plan. We decided 2 of us would focus on designing, and the other 2 would handle the business side. My job? To find investors. Easier said than done, right? We were just teenagers, 18 years old, with no degrees, no formal experience, nothing. All we had was passion. It sounds naive, but we were stubborn. We refused to be told no. For weeks, I kept it a secret from my mother, not wanting to worry her. But eventually, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I told her everything. She was nervous, unsure of how to react. She thought I should go to college, get a degree, something safe. But I told her I was sure about this. I needed her to trust me. Eventually, she came around, but she warned me that convincing my father would be impossible. He hated the idea of guys being into anything even remotely feminine. Fashion? Forget it. If he found out, he might never speak to me again. But we needed the money. And here's the thing: my friends were getting the support they needed from their families, but we had no connections. No one believed in us, not the investors, not anyone. So we had no choice but to turn to our families. I had to speak to my father about funding this business, even though I knew it would be the hardest conversation of my life. At first, the idea of college never really appealed to me. My friends and I were diving into something bigger, our own brand, and that's what I wanted to pursue. That's where I needed my college fund money to go. When I first told my father that I wasn't planning on going to college, his response was uncaring, almost detached. He shrugged it off, saying he was fine with whatever I did. But then, the truth hit me like a ton of bricks. When I told him I would need that college fund to kickstart my business, his tone shifted. He casually informed me that there was no money set aside for me, and that's when the crushing reality sunk in. There never was a college fund. It had all been drained. Everything that my father had financially set aside for me? Gone. Spent entirely on my brother, who had gone to medical school years before me. I knew my brother was in med school. I knew it was expensive. But I always assumed that with my dad's business doing well, there was enough for both of us. Little did I know, my brother wasn't just dipping into my dad's pockets for his education. He was living a lavish lifestyle, constantly spending money that wasn't just for his schooling but for his own pleasure, and my dad was perfectly fine with it. It wasn't until that day, though, that I learned the full extent of what had happened. My dad confessed to me that, around the time my brother left for medical school, he'd handed over his entire life savings to him, almost $120,000. Gone! Just like that. My dad, after giving away everything, had to rely on his salary to make ends meet. And when it came to me, he assumed I wouldn't be going to college, and for all the wrong reasons. He didn't even bother saving a cent for my future because he never thought I was capable of succeeding. It hit me like a slap in the face when he admitted he believed my brother was the bright one. He told me, flat out, that he never expected someone as stupid as me to even consider college. He wasn't joking. He truly believed I would never be good enough to even apply, let alone get accepted anywhere. The only thing I did was prove him right, he said, by choosing to pursue my business dreams instead of higher education. At first, I thought maybe he was kidding, but as the conversation went on, I realized he wasn't. He had truly given up on me. He had nothing for me, no college fund, no support, just empty words. That moment, when I found out how deep his favoritism toward my brother ran, pushed me over the edge. I exploded. Not just because of the money, but because of the way he had insulted me. The way he had written me off completely. I had always known he favored my brother, but to hear him call me stupid? It was the breaking point. I had always thought that maybe, just maybe, he would do something, anything, to help me. But no! He was too selfish, too set in his ways. It was the final straw, and after that, I never spoke to him again. We had laid everything out on the table during that argument, and there was no room left for anything more to be said. I made the decision that day. I would never see him again, and honestly, he seemed fine with it. He knew I would never be like my brother, and maybe that was a relief for him. I moved in with my mom after that. Telling my friends that my dad wouldn't be supporting us financially for the business was tough, but they understood. My mom, though, stepped in. She lent me what she could, and with the rest, we borrowed money from my grandparents, something I had hoped to avoid. I didn't want them dipping into their savings, not when they were getting older, but they were on board. They believed in me, and they helped me get the startup going. Now, looking at how far we've come, I can hardly believe it. Our brand is thriving. It's popular, especially with teens, and it's doing better than I ever imagined. It's a bigger success than my dad's business could ever dream of being. I'm sure that fact stings for him, and maybe that's the only part of this story that brings me a small amount of satisfaction. But then, just 2 weeks ago, something unexpected happened. My dad called. After nearly 3 years of silence. The call was about my brother, and it hit me like a punch to the gut. Eric, my brother, was in serious trouble. After finishing his medical residency, he had gotten himself into massive gambling debt. And not just a little debt, this was big. Dangerous, even. My dad had just found out, and now there were people looking for him. My brother was hiding out with my dad, but that wouldn't keep him safe for long. These people were dangerous, and they were coming for him. And then, of course, my dad asked me for help. Ever since I blocked him, I've been struggling with a gnawing feeling. I know I have the chance to make things right, to offer help, but I'm lost in a storm of confusion. Do they even deserve my help? Or am I just fooling myself into thinking they do? It's a question that haunts me. How do you decide the right thing to do when all the emotions are tangled, when the past weighs so heavily on your soul? It all started 3 years ago when my dad refused to back my business. His excuse? He'd already drained his savings to help my brother. That moment felt like a betrayal I couldn't ignore. I told myself I wouldn't help, that the door was shut. But now, with everything they're going through, I'm caught in a whirlwind of doubt. Update 1. Thank you so much for all the support, I said, taking a deep breath. I've decided to let this sit for a few more days, to think this through, and not let my emotions decide for me. So far, I hadn't told my mom. I didn't want to add any more stress to her already burdened heart. After all, she had cut ties with my dad and my brother around the same time I did. But I knew she worried about him. She couldn't help it, she's a mom. If I told her about my brother's financial troubles, I knew it would send her into a spiral of worry. But, in the end, I had to tell her everything. And what she said surprised me. She told me I had no obligation to help them. Not because she didn't care, but because they'd never had my back. They had never, not once, looked out for me. My dad and brother never apologized for the way they treated me over the years. The bare minimum was all I'd ever gotten. So why should I feel guilty? Eric made his bed. Let him lie in it. My mom said, if he was younger, I'd be worried. But he's in his early 30s. He's old enough to know better. She was right. He had messed up. And my dad had encouraged his bad habits all these years. They created this mess. Now they had to clean it up. I couldn't help but agree with her. But even so, the question still lingered, what was the right thing to do? I still wasn't sure, but my mom made a solid point. This money, it wasn't just some spare change. It was my hard-earned cash, and I wasn't about to hand it over to someone who had gambled away their future. And who knew if they were telling the truth? For all I knew, it could be another elaborate scheme to get money out of me. Honestly, it wouldn't surprise me. After all, I had become more successful than they ever imagined, and I'm sure they didn't like that. Of course, they'd try anything to ruin it for me. Update 2. Okay, so here's the deal, I said, after some time had passed. I decided to do some digging. I needed to know what was really going on, so I wouldn't be stuck with this guilt hanging over me. I wasn't about to just turn my back on them, but I also didn't want to be the sucker they counted on. I couldn't live with myself if something happened to them, if I didn't try. But I wasn't sure what that trying would look like. So, I went to my dad's house. But when I arrived, I was stunned to find out that they'd sold it 3 weeks ago. A new family was already living there. Confused, I talked to the neighbors. They told me that the house had been on the market for nearly a month. Apparently, my dad had made a lot of money from the sale. The house, in a prime location, had been worth a lot, and he'd already received the funds by the time he called me asking for more. Why, I wondered, would he still ask me for help? What was going on? And then, this morning, I got the call. My dad's lawyer said I was being excluded from the will. You heard that right. I wasn't going to inherit anything. Apparently, my dad had set up a test for me to see if I would support my brother. And based on that, he would decide if I was worthy of his inheritance. I can't even begin to understand what kind of twisted mind thinks that this is acceptable behavior. But in a way, I was relieved. I'm glad I didn't play his game. I don't need his money. It's been years of caring for people who never cared for me in return, and I'm done with that. Honestly, it was a huge relief to realize that I wasn't the one who was in the wrong. The mystery had been solved, and now I could breathe again. Still, it stings to know that, if something were to happen, I would never trust them again. They've shown their true colors, and it's pathetic. Update 3. So, here's where I am now. I began, looking back on everything that had happened. Almost a year later, and I'm engaged. Yeah, I know, some people think it's too soon, but when you know, right? And we've known each other since we were kids. She moved away for a while, but now she's back, and it was like no time had passed. We started dating right away. No more wasting time. But the update isn't really about her, though I wish I could go on about her forever. It's about how my dad and brother reacted when they found out about the engagement. They felt the need to email me, telling me they were happy for me and my fiancée, but they wouldn't be attending the wedding. Can you believe that? They said it was inappropriate for them to be there since I didn't like or respect them. They wished me well, but no, they wouldn't come. My mom, my fiancée, and all my friends read that email and had a good laugh about it. Bold of them to even think they'd be invited, right? At least it was good for a laugh. But it's also just another reminder that they haven't changed a bit. They still think the world revolves around them. At least it keeps things entertaining.